Hey everybody, before we start the show, I wanted to let you know about our upcoming live show at Sturdy Shelter on February 21st at 5 p.m. It's called Area Code Batavia Live, Cozy and Community. This show is part of Sturdy Shelter's Cozy Fest, a celebration of taking it easy, finding comfort during difficult times, and warmth during cold times. We are hosting some incredible special guests. We'll have Juliana Cancello and Sylvia Sanchez from Bocaditos and Annie Scholl, fiction writer and former owner of Hearth and Hammer. They are experts in cozy, and in particular have a unique perspective on how we can expand our definition of cozy to something beyond just sitting at home in our PJs watching Bridgerton episodes. So do me a favor and mark the date on your calendar. 630 members get free access to the show for themselves and a friend, and everyone else is welcome to buy tickets at the door with cash or through Venmo. All right, on with the show. Hey everybody, you're listening to Area Code Batavia, a podcast about what it means to belong in Batavia, Illinois. I'm your host, Richard Clark. I feel fortunate to live in Batavia. I can say that for all sorts of reasons, because I love the people, because I love downtown, and in general, I just love the vibe. But one thing that I really love is that I can be proud of the town I live in. That isn't always a given, especially as someone who grew up in the Deep South, surrounded by plantations, cotton mills, and Confederate monuments. But even here in the Midwest, there's a checkered past in lots of the surrounding Chicago suburbs. Some were sundown towns back in the day. Some leaned into unfair housing practices, and others just took a passive stance during key moral crises in our nation and in our communities. But if you look at the history of Batavia, you can see a pattern, one that I've seen come up again and again as we all process our particular community's role in our current national crisis. What we're seeing happen in Minnesota, for instance, is an acute example of how authoritarian overreach can threaten a community's sense of belonging, how fear and anger can lead to loneliness and isolation. But we're also seeing how these moments can define a town, how a town's identity is made and remade by a series of decisions tied to moments like these. That's what I was particularly interested in. So I went back to a friend of the podcast, Kate Garrett, director of the Batavia Depot Museum, to find out how Batavia met the moment and what led this community to make a series of decisions that led us to where we are today. And more importantly, how certain is this identity we take so much pride in? And what will we, as individuals and as a community, have to do to maintain it? Here's my conversation with Kate Garrett. I wanted to talk to you because there's a city council meeting where there was a discussion around the ICE policy and whether or not we would pass ordinance that was saying essentially ICE is not allowed to use city property. And one of the things that was interesting to me was the degree to which Batavia's history came up.
Yeah.
Really, two things jumped out at me. One was the number of people who knew people directly affected by this. And then the other thing was just the number of people who were aware of and calling out Batavia's history with the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
And doing things that seemed like radical acts of justice and standing up for justice and just generally being on the right side of history. And that phrase is interesting. I think a lot of people, you can nuance that phrase to death.
Sure.
So I wanted to talk to you specifically about moments when Batavia was on the right side of history in a sense. So like stood up for justice, stood up for people in a way that when we look back, we can be proud of that.
Yeah.
And I should say for the listeners, before we talked, you said you have been
Yes.
really studying this. This has been a bit of an obsession of yours.
It absolutely has. I'm very interested in this topic specifically. I'm very interested in the experience of Black Americans in Batavia historically. Batavia has a really interesting history of permanent Black residences.
Yeah.
Dating back to the 1850s.
Okay.
And that was such a curious outlier for me when I started working here. It was something I really wanted to understand better. So since taking this job in 2021, it's been a pretty constant filter on all of my research is like,
Yeah.
oh, that I'm going to save that for later. I need to bookmark that. That's going to go into the file. So I've been casually building that information pool. And then for the last year or so, really focusing in on putting pieces together and shaping a narrative and understanding the picture a little bit more completely.
What caused you to focus on that in the last year?
I like to pay attention to the news. I like to know what's going on in the current day as well as this historical view.
Bless you.
Well, it's definitely important because half of what I do is so that I better understand what's going on right now, right? And to give people context for what they're seeing today.
Yeah.
And I was out with a friend at the time when Illinois was receiving a lot of busloads of migrants from Texas. And there was some consternation about whether or not we were going to be able to support that. How are we going to provide for these people?
When did this happen?
Oh my gosh. 2024, 2023, I think.
Okay.
Maybe it was 2024. It feels like a million years ago. So Chicago was receiving busloads, and this was happening in lots of cities across the country.
Yeah.
And there was some worry about whether or not that was going to fit into our culture here today.
And these buses were sent kind of as a troll move, right? As you do something with them then.
Yeah, I think that was the intention.
Yeah.
It reminded me, though, of a story that I had heard when I was pulling resources to talk about this topic, this Batavia during the slavery era, of something that didn't happen in Batavia but happened in Elgin, so part of Kane County. During the Civil War, an entire train of, I think, 1,000 people who had self-emancipated and run to the safety of the Illinois 52nd Regiment, which Don Carlos Newton was a captain in that regiment.
So this was post-Emancipation Proclamation.
This was post-Emancipation Proclamation, but just barely.
Okay.
1863,
Okay.
I think, or 1862. I'm going to have to check my notes on that one, too. There is some concern because the chaplain of that regiment, the chaplain of the 52nd, wanted to send a lot of these refugees essentially up north to Elgin, north to family and friends who he knew up in Kane County would accept and take them in. And there's some interesting records going back and forth about whether or not Elgin should accept these people. Is it legal for these people to come here? We still have these black codes on the books that prohibit the movement of black people into the state. And so this would be in direct defiance of those laws. Whether or not emancipation is a thing or not, this is still illegal in Illinois.
Yeah.
And he basically says, no. These are on orders from the military. That supersedes state law, that this is a military order, and sends a whole bunch of people north to Elgin, many of whom settle in Elgin, but not only. And there's at least a couple of folks in Batavia who are descendants of folks who arrived on the contraband train, is what it's called now.
Yeah, interesting.
And it's not a widely known story.
Yeah.
So it was really fun to be able to share that with my friend and say, like, hey, so we've been here before. We've dealt with this refugee crisis before. And Elgin very proudly said, we've sent 100 of our young men to fight. We'll gladly take 1,000 refugees and find them places. So very much in support of the cause of union, more so than the cause of anti-slavery or anti-racism. But the end results wind up being similar.
Yeah.
So that really got me started on okay, I got to do a better job of articulating this important moment and trying to put pieces together so that I had a better story to tell. It's been such a continual refrain here in Batavia. People have talked about what has Batavia's role been in social justice, what has our role been in Black history, for its easy comparisons to our modern day discussions as well, right? Like those two things have really gone hand in glove. There's also some really interesting work being done right now on some private property in Batavia that might be directly associated with some leading figures of a fairly formal Underground Railroad movement.
Interesting.
That's not my bailiwick. That's being done by other researchers, and they're doing a great job.
Yeah. What other researchers?
So there's a gentleman in town. His name's Eric Krupa.
Okay.
He's fantastic, awesome historian, awesome researcher who's been doing some real deep digging on a man named John Cross, who was a minister and a pretty serious firebrand abolitionist who roamed around Illinois and then went out to Iowa to found the town of Amity. So he has a lot of footprints all over the Midwest, actually, but a lot of them in Illinois. And he's well known as an abolitionist, but there hasn't been a place to mark and commemorate his contributions to that cause until Eric figured out that he had an address here in Batavia, and he's pretty sure he knows the house and that it's still there.
Yeah.
So there's some landmarking stuff going on right now, and that putting in some applications, but the house itself is really interesting, regardless of the results of those applications.
Nice.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is, and I think we even talked a bit about this last time we talked, and this question of what is Batavia's nature? What has Batavia's nature been, really? And I don't just mean sort of in the abstract. Have we done good things? Have we done bad things? But in comparison to other towns, because that's really what a character of a town is.
Yeah.
The character of a town isn't like the same as any other town, right? The nature of a character of the town is what uniquely is true about this town. And so that is one of the things I want to explore is like, what has Batavia done? What has Batavia felt? And in distinction from other towns. Yeah. That's something that's really top of mind. Can you talk about, like, when we just talk broadly about Batavia has done things where they have stood up for justice, they have tried to protect the marginalized, things like that. Can you talk about how, in the aggregate, how consistently they've been in exercising, or we have been in exercising those values?
Man, what a good question. And I think I'd want to circle back a little bit to that, the idea of being on the right side of history, right? And that history is written by the winners, which is the other thing that people say a lot about the filter that happens over time, right? That, like, there are lots of examples that we find in the historic record of people fighting really hard for something that didn't happen, which is, I'm sure, of great frustration to those folks living in their present time, right? And with this sort of filter and this lens of a historical view, we're pulling things that happened to work and talking about those as a kind of inevitability, which I don't think most historians actually buy into, right? That like there is really no right side of history. There is the history that we select for down to the present day.
Those two phrases are really interesting to me because to me, they conflict.
Sure.
Like blatantly. The right side of history implies that there's a wrong and a right morally. So even if slavery never went away, the people who are against it are on the right side of history, and we would look back on those people and recognize that.
Yeah.
But then the idea of history is told by the winners. Well, there's a lot of minorities and people who didn't outright win that we respect. And so in a way, like those two concepts seem at odds, and there's something in the middle, right? There's some truth that you're sort of drawing out, which is that history is also people who tried something and didn't.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think so in Batavia specifically, to give you a really concrete example of that happening, Illinois has a really interesting, complicated history with enslavement, starting with our foundations, mostly by French settlers moving up from the south towards the north, which often surprises folks who think of Chicago as kind of the center of life in Illinois, that most of northern Illinois wasn't settled by European settlers at all until after the Black Hawk Wars conclude, and the removal of native populations who had lived here for time immemorial. With the movement of European settlers north into Illinois comes some complicated relationships with enslavement. Although Illinois is technically a free state, it also has on the books for many years the most restrictive laws governing where Black people could live, if they could move into the state. They're not allowed to serve on juries. They're not allowed to congregate. So there's a ton of restriction around just daily life for Black people that's written into our earliest laws, starting in 1819, the year after we become a state. So Batavians who are arriving here in 1833, let's say, with their very first guys, Christopher Payne, there's an interestingly high percentage of folks who are bringing with them abolitionist ideals, which would not necessarily have been the norm in the most populated regions in Illinois.
Okay.
We're frontier, we're the edge of civilization.
Yeah.
And so it's a good place for people who are on the fringes of what polite society would have deemed acceptable. And that includes a lot of abolitionists.
Yeah.
We see the earliest anti-slavery movements, organized anti-slavery movements in Kane County in 1842. And then it's not until 1863 that we get the Emancipation Proclamation, and not until 65 that we actually repeal the black codes. So this is this huge span of time where people are convinced of a moral certainty, despite the fact that the society around them does not agree.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying that people here largely were convinced that slavery was wrong?
There's a lot of them who are.
Yeah.
It's not a monolith.
Yeah. And that's something I'm interested in. This is where history is told by the winners actually works, because we can talk about the nature of Batavia. Inevitably, we know from experience that neighbors around some of these people didn't agree, right?
Yep. And they lost. So the narrative
right?
of Batavia becomes that we have always been a very welcoming, accepting place. And
Yeah.
I like to complicate that narrative a
Yes.
little bit
Yeah.
by saying that at no point in Batavia's history has that ever been a guarantee. Have we never needed to stand up for the things that we thought were right and the things that we believed in? There's always been the need to do that, and there's always been resistance to that.
The question of like some of these values, so these ideas of belonging and welcoming and embracing people unlike ourselves and protecting people, do you think there's something like baked into the Batavian culture that causes this consistent sort of, not inevitable, but it has happened, where there's a chain of events where we get to feel like we have this character?
Yeah, I think that a good way to understand, or a good way to describe maybe that culture, are the institutions that outlive any individual, right? That can we point to some institutions? Can we point to some larger themes that go beyond just one really exceptional guy or one really exceptional person?
Yeah.
Batavia does have a lot of that. The Congregational Church is a great example of that. Their predecessor was founded in 1835, and specifically founded by a guy named Thomas Paxton and a couple of neighbors of his. And we use neighbors extremely loosely because Thomas Paxton lived on Eola Road, past Fermi. But, his closest neighbors are still the folks up here at the Batavia Ford of the river.
Yeah.
So they form a Presbyterian church. Thomas Paxton was loudly anti-slavery. He had moved to Illinois from southern states, I want to say Tennessee or Kentucky, where his family had been enslavers. They had owned human beings. He disagreed with that pretty strongly and left and spent the rest of his life being a pretty normal farmer, except for these really staunch beliefs about abolition and anti-slavery.
Yeah.
So he's a leading member in founding this church, but he's got a bunch of neighbors who are all on the same page, and they start a church that endures to today. That's really unusual to have any institution endure that long.
Yeah.
So in its founding DNA, the Congregational Church had abolitionist roots. They are host to a couple of religious leaders, pastors who are sort of itinerant ministers who have a circuit that includes Batavia, but also Geneva, St. Charles, a couple of other dots on the map. Batavia is the best one, obviously, but these are traveling ministers who are able to get up and talk about the things that they believe in addition to their religious conviction, right? And those two things go really hand in hand.
Right.
So in the 1840s, we have these ministers who are preaching in Batavia an abolitionist gospel. Very successfully. They get a lot
Just at this one church or in various churches?
At various churches, but
Okay.
it seems to be that Batavia was a central point for
Interesting.
organization. Batavia is the location where they actually formally organized the Kane County Anti-Slavery Society, which
Wow.
is a countywide organization that has a ton of members who are not Batavians, but it does have many Batavians who are signed signatory members
Okay.
of this organization.
I assume that doesn't exist anymore. Okay.
No, but it has sort of descendant groups, right? So
Yeah.
you've got the Kane County Anti-Slavery Society. In the 1840s, the anti-slavery societies in Illinois are going hand in glove with a political party called the Liberty Party,
Okay.
which also doesn't exist anymore, but has sort of morphed into the Whig Party and then into the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln,
Yeah.
and so on down the line to today.
Yeah.
But the Liberty Party in the 1840s is really active in Kane County. They're really stumping, and they're kind of a spoiler party. They don't have enough votes to get their own candidates elected. But if you're not willing to play ball with them on their views on slavery, they're not going to support you and your political aspirations either.
Interesting.
So they actually have enough votes in a couple of key elections in the 40s to move the needle one way or another.
So they're kind of a one-issue party.
Very much a single-issue party.
Yeah.
It's a little more complicated than that because slavery also includes a lot of other stuff about westward expansion and states' rights and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. But their key galvanizing issue is slavery. And prohibiting the expansion of slavery and, for the most extreme opinion, abolishing slavery in the country. But that's pretty extreme by 1840s standards. And it's a position that is adopted by an awful lot of Batavians. So we have a lot of leftists in Batavia.
So interesting.
In the 1840s. And to kind of go back to, we're on the fringes of established European American civilization here. It is fertile ground for people who have not gotten along with their neighbors super well. Yeah. It's a good place to come if your church thought you were too crazy and you're having a hard time sitting in the pews next to all your neighbors.
You're a loudmouth.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's,
why is this place good for those people?
It's definitely full of opportunity. We've talked about that on episodes you've invited me on before, that like there is a lot of potential here in Batavia in the 1840s.
Yeah.
There's great natural resources, amazing opportunity to connect to a region that's burgeoned, that's new. There's not a lot here yet. Great farmland. So you're seeing a lot of potential for something new, but not a lot of established institutions that are already pushing, pulling, and swaying. So
I see. So there's potential to create something different.
Yes, absolutely, 100%.
Is really interesting in that it resonates with me today. It feels like that is true today.
Yeah.
You have these, like the nature and the character. It's so weird. How can a town have a character that seems uncalcified for centuries?
Yeah.
For 2 centuries, a town has had, and to this day, I feel like I know what Geneva is. I know what Naperville is, all of that. But Batavia, in a way that I love, feels up in the air.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of up to me and my friends what this place is. Yeah. How do you keep that in your city's character?
That's a big question.
It is big.
Maybe smarter people than I will come on your podcast later and answer it for you. But I think there is a sense of, there are some things that we just agree are really important to us. And everything else is up for grabs. And some of the things that we've decided as a community we want to continue to go to bat for over and over again are things like making sure that people who live here feel safe. Yeah. And that people are welcome here. And that absolutely goes all the way back to our founding institutions, our founding figures, which is, not a guarantee that it will always be that way, right? Like the people who came out here to start Batavia were also really big on water power mills, which we don't do a lot of anymore. Yeah. So things change.
To your point about it's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
One of my questions is was there ever a moment where we were sort of on the precipice of redefining the nature of the town, where maybe it was close or maybe it was iffy on some issue or some event where Batavia was trying to figure out who it was?
So the work that I've been doing here on this topic and trying to understand the shape of the Black experience here in Batavia in terms of just on a historical scale, not on a personal scale, but on a historical scale. I remember hearing a statistic a long time ago, and I've looked it up, and it is true. In 1860, Batavia had 15 people of color living in Batavia who identified on the census as being Black or mixed race. And that is a third of the total population of Kane County of Black folks who are living in Batavia in 1860. Wow. So why isn't that way anymore? Yeah. Why has our percentage not shifted more to represent Black families? What's up with that? So I really wanted to answer that question. What happened to the Black neighborhood in town at the north end of River Street? Yeah. And found Batavia is not immune to national forces. In the 1920s, 1930s, we start to see some disinvestment from that community, people who've had property passed down from grandfathers, but they live in Michigan now. They don't live here in Batavia. And then we have some really interesting documentation from the 1960s about advocacy for what at the time was called an open housing or a fair housing ordinance, which would have prevented people from discriminating against home buyers based on race, ethnicity, a host of other factors. But that's the big one that we're talking about in Batavia. And there's some interesting pressure to pass an ordinance in Batavia to ensure open and fair housing. A lot of the support for that ordinance is coming from the folks who are helping to get Fermilab off the ground, because there's some pushback that Fermi shouldn't be located in Illinois because Illinois doesn't have a law like this on the books.
Yeah.
And so Batavia, if you want to get this super collider here, if you want to make sure that this facility goes in and you get the benefits of that, you need to make sure that you have an ordinance that supports this issue, which is of national concern.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to read through the minutes from those city council meetings, because we see a lot of the same pushback against that ordinance that I noted at the meetings about the ICE ordinance.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Which are what?
It's just an ordinance. It's not going to do anything. It's not enforceable.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
This is about people. This has to be an issue that we deal with on the individual basis. This can't be an issue that we deal with. The city council government should stay out of it. It's not going to do anything anyway. So there's some really interesting parallels. We did eventually get that ordinance passed in Batavia.
Yeah.
And I haven't done the work to be able to tell you that, yep, it for sure made a difference, or no, it didn't matter at all.
So we don't know if it was enforced.
We don't know if it was enforced, but there is something to be said for the fact that it comes up later on. People bring it up as, well, Batavia's got this law on the books now, which should make it easier for people to find housing. So people reference it down the line.
Yeah.
I'm hoping we get some interesting stories about this. We're always looking for people to come and talk to us about what they remember about X, Y, and Z issue or X, Y, and Z topic. There used to be a really densely populated neighborhood at the north end of River Street that was known to be the Black neighborhood, and a lot of the census records and property records reflect that. But then in the early 1960s, late 1950s, we see a shift from that, led by a lot of different factors. But one of the results is you get people coming to testify at those late 60s Fair Housing Ordinance meetings about what it's like to feel like you're not allowed to buy property anywhere but here in this small section of blocks. And I think that's really interesting, because you can trace that all the way back to the first Black property owners in the 1850s in Batavia, which is wildly early.
Yeah.
But we do now have some actual documentation of some families purchasing lots as early as 1853. And that's huge, way earlier than we would have expected.
Right. So it seems like we have this instance where Black families were essentially pushed out through economic means, right? They could no longer afford to live there because they were kind of being...
Partly that, although interestingly also, it actually in the 60s is going the other way. We're trying to attract engineers. We're trying to attract highly skilled, well-educated folks, and they can't find a place to buy that is suitable for the style of living they want to live.
Yeah.
They're looking not for affordable housing. They're looking for acceptance into middle-class neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And that's what's being denied to them, is that the idea of is this ordinance enforceable? A lot of those restrictions are put in place simply by what houses a real estate agent shows you and what houses they think are not in your budget or not in you won't feel comfortable here, that sort of thing. And then in Batavia, you also have the issue of folks are looking to support Black-owned businesses. And there aren't a lot of those here in Batavia, but there are in Aurora and in Elgin. So if you want to go to a Black dentist because you feel most comfortable there, you can't do it and live in Batavia. So there's this effort to attract a professional class, managers, engineers, brainy people who are drawing high incomes and want upper middle class housing, are having a hard time finding it. There's at least one example in Batavia of somebody buying a lot and building a house because that's what they were permitted socially, culturally to do.
I want to go back to this idea of not everyone believe the same thing.
Yes.
And yet you have these neighbors who live with each other. They have to engage. How did they engage with each other on these issues? Which some of them felt really staunch abolitionists are convicted about what they believe. And you wouldn't think they're going out and making friends with people who don't believe that.
Yeah.
So was there a contingent of people in Batavia, and what you've characterized as a pretty like specific kind of place politically at that time. Mm-hmm. People who felt their own sense of like out of placeness and like put upon by people with those beliefs.
I love that you asked this question because I spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about how heroic this sort of abolitionist fervor is, right? And that like from my perspective today, it seems patently obvious that is the right side of history.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And I also know that it's always more complicated than that.
Totally.
There's a really interesting narrative line in Batavia specifically. So Kane County in general, the most exciting, sensational stories about advocating for anti-slavery and for, actually on the ground assisting self-emancipated people who are trying to get to Canada, assisting them on their journey to do that. The most exciting stories mostly don't come from Batavia. We don't actually have any stories about like someone who was supported by someone transporting them in a wagon through Batavia. Like we just don't have that.
Right.
What we have instead, I think, is really special because we do have a history of property ownership in Batavia in the 50s, 1850s, that signifies not just we're happy to be the heroes of a story and more we want to build community in a very boots on the ground kind of a way. So on North River Street, you've got William Stewart and his family who are the first property owners in town. It's a free black man, his wife Elizabeth, her mother Elizabeth Goings, who in one census said that she was 117 years old. We have no idea when this woman was born, but she came from Virginia. And then their children, Jordan, James, and a daughter named Sarah. And they buy a lot on River Street, which is now part of Laurelwood Park. And he's a barber. So he has a professional career. He's not just a laborer. He's earning pretty decent income. And what he's actually doing is making a ton of relationships with the white residents who are already here in Batavia.
Okay.
That's his main clientele. So definitely a bridge figure in the community. And he lives right next door to John Gregg, who's also the commissioner for the Kane County Almshouse. And he lives a couple of doors away from a whole bunch of people who are signatories to the Kane County Anti-Slavery Society organization.
Yeah.
So folks who are not Alan Pinkertons, they're not the hero on the wagon, like riding through the night.
Right.
What they're actually doing is forming community together. This is someone who's attending church services and his kids go to school with your kids and you go to him for a great shave and a linchpin figure in, I think, the continued settlement of African Americans to that neighborhood split. But that doesn't happen if your neighbors don't welcome you. That kind of safety to raise your kids here has to be a community effort. I think that's really interesting. The neighborhood that he's living in, a couple of clicks up the line in property ownership, was property of Joel McKee, and Joel McKee is a really strong abolitionist in this sort of Batavian way of like quietly so.
Yeah.
He signs his name to a lot of things. He donates a lot of money. He subscribes to abolitionist newspapers. He advertises in the papers. But again, he's not necessarily an agent of the Underground Railroad. He's not a spy. He's a stable figure that allows for a community to grow.
Is most of Batavia like these quiet types of advocates?
That's the most common type that I've seen represented in the historical record.
Okay.
We certainly have some more firebrand, exciting figures, but they mostly come and go. They don't stay here. They're traveling ministers. They're moving on to other things. They've got big business plans elsewhere, and so they pop in for a little bit like John Cross and Lucian Farnham, and then they're off to other things.
So two things are happening. There's these like quiet conversations. There's like getting to know people, getting to know each other, and donating money, but then these institutional and structural things that are allowing for this cause to be moved forward.
Yeah.
And then there's now. And when I think about the nature of these kinds of dialogues now, I think of bumper stickers. I think of rallies. I think of Facebook. I don't think those are worse. I think we're doing other things too. Maybe we're doing all of that. I'm thinking out loud about whether one thing harms the other.
Yeah, let me share from a historical perspective. The material culture and those loudest stories are the most likely to be sustained in the historic record, but they are not the most likely to have sustained effects in the historic record.
Do they harm sustained effect?
Good question. I would say in Batavia and in Kane County for the Anti-Slavery Society movement, no,
Okay.
I don't think they harm. I think it's galvanizing in a way. It makes people figure out what side they're on.
It can normalize a certain
When you
perspective.
make an issue black and white,
Yeah.
and you say you make a resolution like the Congregational Church did and said, we have no association with anyone who accepts any slaveholder to any of their congregations. It's like, okay, well, that's a lot of people who you are now no longer in brotherhood with.
That's a crazy thing for a church to do.
Oh, yeah. Super wild. Super wild.
Right or wrong. It's intense.
It's intense.
Yeah.
And you can do it when the majority of your congregational base is not in the South, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a position of privilege that you get to take because of the limited influences that you have pulling you in the other direction. When you have to figure out how we get along together, you're much more likely to make a compromise that you otherwise would find morally objectionable, maybe.
Right.
So in the case of the Congregationalists, there's one clear example. One of the deacons of the church, he's like the layman who's in charge of stuff. He's not a minister, but he stays in the community. His name's Elijah Town. And he comes to Batavia after serving as a missionary in Mississippi to the Choctaw tribes.
Okay.
The Choctaw are one of the civilized tribes. I'm putting that in air quotes, which listeners won't see, but now I'm going to say out loud, quote unquote, civilized tribes who have adopted a lot of European customs, including a tradition of enslavement. They owned slaves.
Okay.
And because of Elijah's missionary work to this group, when his church here in Batavia says, we're not going to support any missionaries who talk to anybody in the South who has slaves, he's thinking about his personal experience of being a missionary to the Choctaw. And he's saying, what do you mean? That those people, it is more important that they hear the word than that we hold them to this standard, which is contradictory to everything else we've ever told them.
Yeah.
We expect them to do.
Yeah.
And he really struggles with that. And so he actually makes a statement that goes into the church record that he opposes that particular measure.
Okay.
He has the context to understand that in a way that nobody else in the congregation does. So it's a much more complicated issue for him, even though we have no other reason to think that he's not an abolitionist. He's sort of been portrayed as pro-slavery in the historic record. And I think he's a really good example of it being a little more complicated than just a black and white issue. But having the statements from the church that say, nope, we are 100% this or not at all this, makes it very clear and helps people figure out what side they actually fall in on.
Am I right in interpreting that? So there was a moment in time when a church said, you are not allowed to talk to?
There's a bunch of different statements that they come out with, and they're all a little bit legally because they're resolutions. One of them in this particular case is that we're not sending any money to the American Missionary Society that's funding missions because some of those missions have members who sometimes serve in congregations. So it's a very
For a
hard
minute,
line.
I thought you were saying like you're not allowed to engage with, fraternize essentially with people who disagree with you on this issue, which would be a big deal for the town, right?
Yeah, and in Batavia, not so much an issue, right?
Yeah.
Because what's the likelihood you're going to have a casual conversation or do business with someone who is an enslaver? But that is how it shakes out in other places.
Okay, so Batavia's taken a lot of stands. Batavia, people in Batavia, sometimes the government, sometimes the people, sometimes influencers within. What have these stands cost Batavia in your mind? Because these inevitably cost something. And it sounds like Batavia does stand out a bit from within our Kane County, our general whatever. So what do you think it's cost us?
My gut reaction to that question, or my gut instinct to respond to that is that for the most part, we have not paid a penalty that we have not deemed worthy, which is to say that I think people who live in Batavia now are really happy to live here and not somewhere else because of the sequences of events that have led us to where we are today, right?
Yeah.
That like, there's not, oh man, I would have moved to Batavia, except in 1850, they made a really bad choice. And like, I'm trying to think about situations where we lost out on something because of these stances, or a penalty was paid, or some other kind of cost was waged. And I'm having a hard time figuring out On a community level, if I have any examples. On an individual, personal level, yeah, 100%. There are people who lose out on business deals and have to move town because they said, I want the bridge here and not here, and they lost, and so now they have to leave.
Okay.
Or there's an example, T.C. Moore is a lawyer in Batavia historically, 1860s, 1850s. So he's active at the time of all of the stuff that we've kind of been talking about for the anti-slavery stuff. He is a Whig. He's not a Liberty Party guy, but he's a pretty abolitionist Whig and very outspoken and a good legal mind and claimed to have been an associate of Lincoln's and that kind of thing. He also said he was the secretary at the first organizing party of the Republican Party, but he did not apparently keep those notes. So not a great secretary, if so. But really interesting guy. He had an arson attack at his house once upon a time. Could have just been kids burning some rubbish, but probably not, considering everything else. We don't have a lot of sore thumbs sticking up waiting for hammers.
Okay.
Or not a lot of nails sticking up waiting for hammers. We have the people who are the loudest tend to not stay. Maybe this is a fairly abstract cost to pay, but people who were the loudest have left very light fingerprints in my historical record here. So when I'm trying to do research about Lucian Farnham, who is a leader in statewide Liberty Party abolition work, almost nothing of him or his family has been sustained through the storyline here in Batavia. He didn't raise kids here. He didn't have a business here. His kids didn't go to school here. We don't have a legacy of his left in this community, except for the legacy of the work that he did.
Okay. Because why?
Because he just didn't stay. And I think that's temperamental for him. That seems to be the case for a lot of these ministers. Like, they just don't like to put down roots.
They're itinerant people.
Yeah, John Cross is a great example of this. He's all over the Midwest.
I wonder if that's a kind of cost.
I think that's a personal cost.
I have a
people
question here. Who are Batavia's heroes? And there's this feeling of like, and I feel this a lot. Like, we talk about Mary Todd Lincoln. We talk about Mark Twain, and the story is they were here once.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of like homegrown heroes that stuck around in the loud vein, which I think, we want to super qualify that with like, we've just talked about a ton of heroes. They just don't have individual names in this telling.
Yep. I name dropped a lot of people who did incredibly heroic things because of the way they stepped just a little bit offside of the status quo, right? And did something a little bit unusual, but then stuck around and dealt with the consequences of those choices, right? I'll go back to the Stewarts. William Stewart, I mentioned that he had 3 kids here in Batavia, Sarah and his 2 sons, Jordan and James. Jordan and James both sign up underage. They were illegal members of the U.S. colored troops when Abraham Lincoln finally lets people of color serve in the military during the Civil War. They both sign up to go. Almost every black man in Batavia of fighting age enlists. I can think of one example who doesn't. And for 15 people, that's a lot of people who are signing up to volunteer for this effort. James and Jordan enlist. They go down south. They fight in the Battle of the Crater, which I don't know, maybe you're familiar with, but
I'm not.
The Battle of the Crater is that opening scene in Cold Mountain where the Confederate fort gets undermined, it gets blown up, and the Union forces go into the hole and they're just fishing a barrel for the Confederates on the wall.
Oh, wow.
James and Jordan are in that battle, and Jordan is killed.
Okay.
So it's like 14-year-old kid gets killed in action. His brother James comes home and then lives the whole rest of his life here in Batavia working as a barber up until 1934, I think.
Wow.
And really is a focal point for the black community in Batavia, but also liaising with the white community because most of his clientele are the white men with whiskers who need their beards trimmed. So absolutely this sort of bridge personality who's building community on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit about Don Carlos Newton in our spring exhibit, which is all about people who sacrificed in order to ensure the rights of the Declaration of Independence. It's our 250th anniversary exhibit. We're going a little bit broad. Yeah. And we're talking about people who fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Awesome.
Don Carlos Newton's going to be featured in there, who was just a guy who recruited a whole bunch of men to go fight in the war and volunteered very early on and was elected to be the captain of his men and one of his legacies is a ton of letters home to his wife, who's still here in Batavia. And in every letter home, he's talking about somebody's health in the regiment and make sure you get this basket of supplies to wife and check in on his baby daughter. And like, it's a lot of making sure everybody has what they need and that everybody's safe and okay. That's the kind of hero I really admire.
Yeah.
The people who are doing the day-to-day work.
That's great. Which leads me to my last question is, what have we gained from taking this stand?
I think it has all fed into our sense of common purpose together, a sense of we are in this together kind of an idea that is so much a feature when you talk to people about Batavia and what they love about Batavia, right? They'll talk about the toy drive. The toy drive happened because we all decided we were in this thing together and that no kid should go without during the holidays. We talk about the city of good energy. We talk about neighborliness. I love the sidewalk shoveling program for the sidewalk, the snow angels.
So my last interview was with Kathy Evangelista from the Batavia United Way. And we were talking about how the Batavia United Way started originally as the Batavia Community Chest in the 1930s in the midst of the Depression. And that is really interesting to me. Yeah. We were talking about this idea that the impulse of Batavians in a moment where there is scarcity is to give, is to create a new way to give more money. And that seems to be sort of the consistent outflow of what we're talking about.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that's something that you do it once, you do it twice, you make it a habit, you get into the habit of it. Now it becomes an expectation. Now it's a shared community expectation.
Yeah.
And I think that's how you get that enduring texture in a community, right? That like it's all well and good for the Congregationalist Church to have one really firebrand minister who gives like 7 great sermons.
And he's known for being that, the standout guy who does that thing.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And it's so cool that we have these exceptional figures. There's also a real value to the fact that like the church didn't backpedal on any of that stuff after he left. That it's the whole membership is, if not 100% behind this, and there's some records that talk about just how contentious that was within that church congregation, that like, yes, they went for it eventually, and that's how we remember them now, but that was not a given. That was not something we could take for granted. That was something that required work and conflict resolution to get to the other side of. I think that practice of conflict resolution is another real benefit to a community. How do we talk these things through? What is our tradition of arriving at these decisions? And the fact that we've got 14 council members and they take hours of public comment before they arrive at their opinions has been part of the thing that we've built together as a community. The lessons that we've learned about, we do value diversity, we do value safety, we do value taking care of each other.
Thanks for listening to Area Code Batavia. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our newsletter? Just click the link in the show notes and put in your email address. Most importantly, if you know someone who would love to hear this podcast, please share it with them. Word of mouth is the best way to grow this community and help more people feel like they belong in Batavia, Illinois. Area Code Batavia is produced by Area Code Audio. It's hosted and produced by me, Richard Clark, with additional production help from Jennifer Clark.